The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Jefferson County Courthouse as 7-year-old Lily Matthews walked through the heavy oak doors, her small hand trembling as she gripped the leather leash of Hero, a magnificent golden retriever whose calm amber eyes seemed to understand the weight of this moment. The courthouse hallways, normally echoing with the confident footsteps of lawyers and the hushed conversations of legal professionals, fell into an unusual silence as people stopped to watch the unlikely pair make their way toward courtroom 3A. Lily's grandmother, Margaret Matthews, followed closely behind, her weathered hands clutching a tissue that had been twisted into a small knot from nervous fidgeting. She had been Lily's guardian since that horrific night 6 months ago when everything changed. The little girl who once filled their home with laughter and endless chatter about her favorite cartoons and playground adventures had become a shadow of herself, communicating only through nods, headshakes, and the occasional written note when absolutely necessary. The courtroom doors opened with a ceremonial creak, revealing a scene that looked more like a theater than a place of law. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by reporters with their notebooks ready, concerned citizens who had followed the case through months of headlines, and the families of other victims who saw this trial as their only hope for justice. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses focused on the entrance, waiting for the star witness who couldn't speak. At the defendant's table sat Thomas Kane, a man whose ordinary appearance made his alleged crimes all the more chilling. 42 years old, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he looked more like an accountant than a killer. His expensive navy suit was perfectly pressed, and his hands were folded calmly on the polished wooden table. Only the slight nervous twitch in his left eye betrayed any anxiety about what was to come. His defense attorney, Marcus Webb, whispered something in his ear, causing Kane to glance toward the entrance where Lily had just appeared. The prosecution table buzzed with nervous energy. Lead prosecutor Amanda Foster, a 15-year veteran known for her relentless pursuit of justice, shuffled through her notes one final time. Her assistant, David Chun, adjusted his tie and checked the special equipment they had requested for this unprecedented testimony. Neither had ever handled a case quite like this one, where their star witness was a traumatized child who hadn't spoken since witnessing her babysitter's murder. As Lily made her way down the center aisle, Hero walked with the measured pace of a professional. His special courthouse vest, emblazoned with facility dog, do not pet, marked him as more than just a pet. He had been specially trained for this moment, spending months learning not just basic obedience, but a complex system of communication that would soon shock everyone in attendance. His golden coat had been brushed to perfection, and his gentle brown eyes swept the room, assessing threats and maintaining his protective stance beside his small charge. Judge Patricia Harrison, a stern but fair woman with 30 years on the bench, watched the scene unfold with barely concealed amazement. In all her years of presiding over criminal cases, she had never allowed a dog in her courtroom, let alone as part of a testimony. The legal precedent they were about to set would be studied in law schools for decades to come. She had spent weeks reviewing case law, consulting with child psychology experts, and debating with both legal teams before making the controversial decision to allow this unusual testimony method. The gallery held its collective breath as Lily approached the witness stand. Her small white dress, chosen carefully by her grandmother to make her appear even more innocent and vulnerable, seemed to glow under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Her dark hair was pulled back with a simple blue ribbon, and her large brown eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on the one face that brought her comfort, Hero, who had positioned himself at the base of the witness stand according to his training. Court reporter Maria Gonzalez prepared her stenography machine, uncertain how she would transcribe testimony that might not include any actual words. The bailiff, Officer Thompson, had been specially briefed on courthouse dog protocols and stood ready to maintain order if the unusual nature of the testimony caused disruptions. Even the usually stoic court clerk seemed mesmerized by the profound gravity of the moment. In the front row of the gallery, Dr. Rebecca Torres sat with a notebook full of observations and a heart full of hope. A child trauma specialist had spent the last 3 months developing something that had never been attempted in a court of law: a comprehensive communication system between a traumatized child and her therapy dog. Every gesture, every subtle movement, every glance had been practiced and perfected until it became a language that only Lily and Hero understood. The victim's family, including babysitter Sarah Mitchell's parents, sat in the second row with tears already forming in their eyes. Their 19-year-old daughter had been studying to become an elementary school teacher when her life was brutally cut short. This little girl represented their only chance at seeing their daughter's killer brought to justice. As Judge Harrison called the court to order, the room fell into a silence so complete that the gentle sound of Hero's breathing seemed amplified. Lily's small hand found the smooth fur on top of Hero's head, and for just a moment, she seemed to draw strength from the contact. The entire legal system was about to witness something that would change the way courts handle vulnerable witnesses. Forever, the judge's gavel came down with a decisive bang, and history was about to be made in the most unlikely way possible, through the unbreakable bond between a traumatized child and her four-legged guardian, who together would deliver testimony that no one in that packed courtroom would ever forget. 3 months earlier, Prosecutor Amanda Foster sat in her cramped office at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by towers of case files and empty coffee cups, staring at the most frustrating case of her 15-year career. The evidence against Thomas Kane was overwhelming. His fingerprints on the back door, his DNA under Sarah Mitchell's fingernails, his cell phone pinging towers near the crime scene at the exact time of the murder. Yet without Lily Matthews' eyewitness testimony, Foster knew her case had more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese that any competent defense attorney could exploit. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Foster flipped through the psychiatric evaluation reports for the 100th time. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the court-appointed child psychiatrist, had been blunt in her assessment. The child has experienced severe psychological trauma resulting in selective mutism. She may never speak about what she witnessed that night. Forcing her to testify could cause irreparable psychological damage. The words felt like a death sentence for Foster's case and for the families of Kane's other suspected victims. Foster's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Coming home tonight?" She glanced at the clock and realized she'd been at the office for 16 straight hours again. This case was consuming her life, but she couldn't let it go. Sarah Mitchell had been the same age as Foster's own daughter when she was murdered, and the thought of Kane walking free to potentially kill again made her stomach churn with rage and determination. That's when her assistant, David Chun, knocked on her office door with an expression that was equal parts excitement and uncertainty. "Amanda, there's someone here to see you. Says she has an idea that might help with the Matthews girl." Chun stepped aside to reveal Dr. Rebecca Torres, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She carried a worn leather briefcase and had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to working with difficult situations. "Miss Foster, I'm Dr. Torres from the Children's Trauma Recovery Center," she began, settling into the chair across from Foster's cluttered desk. "I've been following the Kane case, and I have a proposition that might sound crazy, but I believe it could work." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder filled with research papers, photographs, and handwritten notes. "Have you ever heard of animal-assisted testimony?" Foster looked skeptical. "You mean therapy dogs?" We already discussed that with the judge. Having a comfort animal present might help Lily feel calmer, but she still won't speak. Dr. Torres smiled and shook her head. No, I'm talking about something much more sophisticated. What if Lily didn't have to speak at all? What if she could tell her story through her dog? She spread several photographs across Foster's desk, showing children working with various dogs in what appeared to be therapy sessions. I've been developing a communication system for traumatized children who can't verbally express their experiences. It's based on subtle hand signals, body positioning, and trained responses from specially prepared therapy dogs. Foster leaned forward, intrigued despite her exhaustion. Explain how this would work. The child learns a series of discrete gestures and movements that correspond to specific concepts: people, actions, emotions, locations. Dr. Torres explained, pulling out a detailed chart. The dog is trained to respond to these signals with precise behaviors that essentially translate the child's nonverbal communication into something a jury can understand. It's not tricks or performance. It's a legitimate language system. Chun, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. Has this ever been used in a courtroom before? Dr. Torres hesitated. Not exactly. I've used variations of this system in therapy settings with remarkable success, but never as legal testimony. That said, courts have accepted sign language interpretation, and this is conceptually similar, just using a different kind of interpreter. Foster felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. What would you need from us? Time, patience, and a very special dog, Dr. Torres replied. I have a golden retriever named Hero, who's been trained in advanced communication work. He's incredibly intelligent and has worked with several traumatized children. But Lily would need to build a relationship with him, learn the signal system, and practice until the communication becomes natural and reliable. The three of them spent the next 2 hours poring over research studies, legal precedents, and practical considerations. Dr. Torres explained that the system worked because it bypassed the verbal processing centers of the brain that trauma often damages, allowing children to access memories through physical and visual pathways that remained intact. The key, Dr. Torres emphasized, is that this isn't about teaching the dog tricks. It's about giving Lily a voice through a medium she can control. The dog becomes an extension of her ability to communicate, not a performer doing commands. Foster felt her prosecutor's instincts kicking in. What are the potential legal challenges? Plenty, Dr. Torres admitted. The defense will argue it's unreliable, that it's not real testimony, that it's prejudicial because juries love dogs. But if we can demonstrate that the communication is consistent, specific, and that Lily truly understands what she's communicating, we might have a chance. By 2 a.m., they had outlined a preliminary plan. Dr. Torres would begin working with Lily immediately, introducing Hero gradually and building trust before attempting any communication training. They would document every session, film the progress, and bring in independent experts to verify the reliability of the system. There's one more thing, Dr. Torres said as they prepared to leave. This will only work if Lily wants it to work. We can't force her to participate. She has to choose to trust us, trust Hero, and trust that telling her story is safe. Foster nodded grimly. Then we better make sure she knows that Hero and all of us are on her side. As Dr. Torres left that night, Foster felt something she hadn't experienced since taking the case: genuine hope. It was unconventional, unprecedented, and potentially brilliant. Or it could be the end of her career if it backfired spectacularly in front of a jury. Either way, it was Lily Matthews' best chance at justice, and Foster was willing to stake everything on a little girl and her golden retriever. The morning of the trial dawned gray and ominous, with thick clouds hanging low over Jefferson County like a heavy blanket of foreboding. By 7 a.m., news vans had already lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Reporters clutched steaming coffee cups and rehearsed their opening lines, knowing they were about to witness legal history in the making. Inside the courthouse, defense attorney Marcus Webb adjusted his silver tie and surveyed his reflection in the men's room mirror with the confidence of a predator preparing for the hunt. At 58, Webb had built his reputation on getting the impossible acquittals: the drunk driver who killed a family of 4, the domestic abuser whose wife fell down the stairs, the corporate executive who embezzled millions from a children's charity. His success rate was legendary, his methods ruthless, and his fees astronomical. Webb had spent the previous evening in his penthouse office, strategizing with his team of junior associates who feared him as much as they admired his courtroom prowess. The plan was simple but devastating: systematically destroy the credibility of a communication system between a traumatized child and a dog, making the entire prosecution look like desperate fools grasping at legal straws. Ladies and gentlemen, Webb had told his team, pacing before a wall-sized whiteboard covered with attack strategies, by the time I'm finished, that jury will see this so-called testimony as nothing more than a circus act designed to manipulate their emotions. A mute child and a trained dog cannot provide evidence in a murder trial, and I intend to make that crystal clear. His lead associate, Jennifer Walsh, had raised a concern. The media coverage has been overwhelmingly sympathetic to the child. The public sees this as innovative and compassionate. Webb's eyes had flashed with cold calculation. Public opinion doesn't decide verdicts, juries do. And juries respond to logic, precedent, and reasonable doubt. I'll give them plenty of all. 3. Now, as Webb entered courtroom 3A at precisely 8:30 a.m., he commanded attention with his imposing presence. Standing 6'3" with silver hair perfectly styled, and a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, he moved through the courtroom like a general surveying a battlefield. His briefcase, made of rich burgundy leather, contained not just legal documents, but psychological profiles of each juror, detailed research on their backgrounds, and a carefully crafted strategy to exploit every possible weakness in the prosecution's unprecedented case. The jury had been selected after 3 grueling days of voir dire, during which both sides had battled over every potential juror. Webb had successfully eliminated anyone with children under 10, anyone who owned a dog, and anyone who had expressed strong opinions about animal intelligence or therapy animals. What remained was a carefully curated group of 12 individuals who, Webb believed, would be skeptical of emotional appeals and focused purely on legal precedent. Juror number 7, Margaret Chun, a retired accountant with no pets and a reputation for logical thinking, sat in the front row of the jury box, already taking notes despite the fact that opening statements hadn't begun. Webb had specifically wanted her analytical, detail-oriented, and likely to view the dog testimony as unscientific nonsense. Across the courtroom, Prosecutor Amanda Foster felt the weight of 3 months of preparation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had barely slept the night before, running through her opening statement repeatedly while her husband tried unsuccessfully to calm her nerves. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about validating a revolutionary approach that could help countless other traumatized children find their voice in the justice system. Foster's team had prepared for every possible attack Webb might launch. They had expert witnesses on standby, video documentation of Lily and Hero's training sessions, and independent verification of the communication system's reliability from 3 different child psychology experts. But Foster knew that all the preparation in the world wouldn't matter if the jury saw their approach as a desperate gimmick rather than legitimate testimony. In the gallery, the atmosphere crackled with tension and anticipation. Sarah Mitchell's parents, Robert and Linda, sat in the second row, their faces etched with the exhaustion of 6 months of grief and hope deferred. Linda clutched a small framed photo of her daughter, Sarah, laughing at her 19th birthday party just 2 weeks before her murder. They had already endured 3 postponements, 2 failed plea negotiations, and countless sleepless nights, wondering if their daughter's killer would escape justice on a technicality. Behind them sat the families of Kane's other suspected victims, women whose cases had gone cold for lack of evidence, whose families had watched helplessly as their loved one's killer remained free. For them, Lily Matthews represented more than just a witness. She was their last hope for answers, closure, and justice. Thomas Kane himself sat at the defense table with an expression of studied calm that belied the nervous energy radiating from his every movement. His left leg bounced rhythmically under the table, and he repeatedly adjusted his glasses with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Despite his ordinary appearance, there was something unsettling about his pale gray eyes, a coldness that seemed to assess everyone in the room as potential prey. Judge Patricia Harrison entered the courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of some majestic bird of prey. The bailiff's call of "All rise" echoed through the packed room, and 200 people stood as one, the rustle of clothing and shuffling of feet creating a symphony of anticipation. As the judge took her seat and called the court to order, Webb rose to deliver his opening statement, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and bending juries to his will. The battle for Thomas Kane's freedom and for the future of how traumatized children could seek justice was about to begin in earnest. The courtroom fell into an otherworldly silence as prosecutor Amanda Foster approached 7-year-old Lily Matthews, who sat perched on the witness stand like a small bird poised for flight. A specially designed booster cushions elevated her tiny frame so the microphone could capture even the slightest whisper, though everyone in the room knew whispers weren't what they were about to witness. Below her, Hero lay in his designated position, his golden coat gleaming under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on his young partner with unwavering attention. Foster had practiced this moment hundreds of times in her mind, but nothing could have prepared her for the electric tension that now filled the air. Every breath seemed amplified, every small movement magnified. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenography machine, uncertain how to record testimony that might contain no actual words. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, her decades of courtroom experience providing no roadmap for what was about to unfold. "Lily," Foster began, her voice deliberately soft and reassuring. "I know this is scary, but you're very brave. Can you show the court what you saw on the night of October 15th, when Sarah was babysitting you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the legal system thought it knew about evidence and testimony. For a long moment, Lily simply stared at the packed courtroom, her dark brown eyes darting from face to face, taking in the sea of strangers who had gathered to hear her story. Her small hands trembled slightly as they rested on the wooden rail of the witness stand. In the gallery, her grandmother Margaret clutched a tissue so tightly her knuckles had turned white, silently praying that the 3 months of preparation would pay off in this crucial moment. Dr. Rebecca Torres, seated in the front row with her notebook and timer, watched with the intensity of a scientist observing a critical experiment. Every gesture, every micro-expression was being catalogued and analyzed. She had spent countless hours with Lily and Hero, developing their communication system from scratch. But this was the ultimate test of whether a traumatized child could find her voice through her 4-legged interpreter. Lily's eyes finally settled on Hero, and something shifted in her posture. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Determination, perhaps, or trust in the golden retriever, who had become her most faithful companion. She took a slow, deliberate breath and placed her right hand against her collarbone, fingers spread wide against the white fabric of her dress. The gesture was so subtle that several jurors leaned forward, straining to see what she had done. But Hero's response was immediate and unmistakable. The magnificent golden retriever rose smoothly to his feet, his movement fluid and purposeful, and walked with measured steps to a predetermined spot directly in front of the jury box. There he sat with perfect posture, his body facing the defense. Table where Thomas Kane sat frozen, his pale gray eyes locked on the dog with an expression of dawning horror. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom like a wave. Margaret Chun, juror number 7, dropped her pen with a small clatter that echoed in the silence. In the gallery, Sarah Mitchell's mother Linda gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth, as the significance of what they were witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't a trick or a performance. This was communication in its purest form. Defense attorney Marcus Webb shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial and has no basis in established legal precedent. A dog's behavior cannot constitute testimony in a court of law." Judge Harrison raised her hand for silence, her expression grave but fascinated. "Mr. Webb, we discussed this extensively during pretrial motions. The court has allowed this testimony. Method based on expert evaluation and documented reliability. The objection is overruled, but noted for the record." Webb's face flushed red with barely controlled anger as he sank back into his chair, already calculating his next move. Beside him, Kane had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles stood out like white marbles beneath his skin. The confident composure he had maintained throughout the trial was beginning to crack. Foster felt her heart pounding as she continued the examination. "Lily, can you show us where you were when you saw what happened to Sarah?" She had to maintain her professional demeanor, but inside she was marveling at the profound communication taking place before her eyes. This time, Lily's response was even more subtle. She touched her left temple with just her index finger, a gesture so brief that several spectators missed it entirely. But Hero was watching with laser focus. He immediately moved to the far corner of the courtroom, near the jury box, and lay down in a position that perfectly mimicked someone hiding or crouching. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as spectators realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in legal history. Reporters frantically scribbled notes, trying to capture not just the facts, but the emotional impact of this revolutionary testimony method. The sketch artist in the front row had abandoned her usual portrait work and was instead drawing wide shots that captured the unique dynamic between the child, the dog, and the spellbound courtroom. Kane's defense team huddled in urgent whispered consultation, their carefully prepared strategy crumbling as they watched the prosecution present evidence in a way they had never encountered before. Webb's junior associates flipped through thick binders of legal precedents, searching desperately for any case law that might help them challenge what was clearly becoming damaging testimony. In the jury box, the 12 men and women sat transfixed, their initial skepticism giving way to fascination and growing understanding. Even Margaret Chun, the retired accountant whom Webb had specifically selected for her logical, unemotional approach, found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the unfolding communication between the traumatized child and her remarkable canine interpreter. As Foster prepared her next question, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, sensing that they were witnessing not just a murder trial, but the birth of an entirely new form of justice. The atmosphere in courtroom 3A had reached a fever pitch of anticipation as prosecutor. Amanda Foster prepared to ask the question that would either make or break their revolutionary case. The previous 20 minutes of testimony had established that Lily's communication system was real, reliable, and remarkably precise. Now came the moment that would determine whether Thomas Kane would spend the rest of his life in prison or walk free to potentially kill again. Foster approached the witness stand with deliberate slowness, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she was certain the courtroom microphones would pick up the sound. She had rehearsed this crucial question countless times with Dr. Torres and her team, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of this moment. In the gallery, Sarah Mitchell's parents leaned forward with desperate hope, while Kane's other suspected victims' families held their breath in collective anticipation. "Lily," Foster began, her voice steady despite the tsunami of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I need you to be very brave now. Can you show us exactly what the bad man did to Sarah that night?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, its implications reverberating through every corner of the packed courtroom. Thomas Kane's face had drained of all color, his pale gray eyes darting between Lily and Hero with the panic of a cornered animal. His hands, which had been gripping the defense table, now trembled visibly as the reality of what was about to unfold crashed over him like a tidal wave. Defense attorney Marcus Webb sat rigid in his chair, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to object at the first sign of anything he could challenge. Dr. Rebecca Torres gripped her notebook so tightly that her fingernails left crescent-shaped indentations in the leather cover. This was the moment she had both anticipated and dreaded for 3 months. Everything they had worked toward, every hour of training, every breakthrough in communication, had led to this single question that would test whether a traumatized child could deliver the most important testimony of her young life. Lily's response began almost imperceptibly. Her small body seemed to shrink further into the witness chair as the weight of the question settled over her like a heavy blanket. For nearly 30 seconds, she sat motionless, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears as she struggled with memories that had haunted her for 6 months. The courtroom held its collective breath, 200 people suspended in a moment of profound silence. Then, with a courage that belied her 7 years, Lily slowly raised her right hand to her throat. Her movements were deliberate, but trembling, each gesture carrying the weight of witnessed horror. Her small fingers formed a shape that was barely visible to most observers, a subtle positioning near her neck that lasted only seconds, but contained within it the most damning evidence possible. Hero's response was immediate and devastating. The golden retriever rose from his position with the gravity of a creature who understood the solemnity of his role. He walked with measured steps to where Court Officer Jim Bradley stood near the defendant's table, his movement purposeful and precise. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Hero gently took Officer Bradley's wrist in his mouth, not biting, but holding with the careful control of a dog trained to communicate rather than attack. The retriever then pulled downward in a slow, deliberate motion that perfectly mimicked the act of strangulation. As the demonstration concluded, Hero released the officer's wrist and lay down completely still, his body motionless in a way that could only represent death. The courtroom exploded. The collective gasp that erupted from the gallery was unlike anything ever heard in Jefferson County Courthouse's 150-year history. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very soul of humanity, confronted with innocence bearing witness to ultimate evil. Sarah Mitchell's mother, Linda, let out a strangled sob and buried her face in her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with the violence of her grief and vindication. Juror number 4, Michael Rodriguez, a construction foreman with 2 daughters of his own, audibly whispered, "Jesus Christ," before catching himself and covering his mouth in horror. Margaret Chun, the retired accountant who Webb had counted on for cold logic, sat frozen with tears streaming down her face, her analytical mind completely overwhelmed by the emotional impact of what she had just witnessed. Several reporters in the back row stopped taking notes entirely, their professional objectivity shattered by the profound innocence of a child demonstrating the brutal murder of her babysitter through her canine interpreter. The sketch artist's hand trembled so violently she had to set down her pencil, unable to continue capturing what felt too sacred and terrible to record. In the jury box, the impact was seismic. Juror number 9, elderly Mrs. Patterson, gripped the rail in front of her so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The young graduate student in seat number 12 stared open-mouthed at Hero, who had returned to his position beside Lily with the calm professionalism that made his demonstration all the more chilling. Thomas Kane himself had gone rigid, his entire body locked in a paralysis of recognition and terror. The careful mask of innocence he had maintained throughout the trial had completely cracked, replaced by the haunted expression of a man watching his deepest secrets exposed by the most unlikely witnesses possible. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. Defense attorney Webb shot to his feet like a man on fire, his voice cracking with desperate authority. Objection. This is beyond prejudicial. It's inflammatory theater designed to manipulate the jury's emotions rather than present factual evidence. Judge Harrison, her own composure shaken by what she had just witnessed, raised a trembling hand for order. The courtroom slowly quieted, but the emotional residue of Lily's demonstration hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Mr. Webb, the objection is noted, but overruled. The demonstration appears to be responsive to the question asked. In that moment, everyone in courtroom 3 understood they had witnessed something that would change the legal system forever. The testimony of ultimate truth delivered by ultimate innocence through the unbreakable bond between a child and her faithful companion. The lunch recess had done nothing to diminish the electric tension crackling through courtroom 3A as defense attorney Marcus Webb rose for cross-examination, his usual predatory confidence replaced by the desperate energy of a man watching his carefully constructed defense collapse in real time. His silver hair, normally perfectly styled, showed signs of stress-induced dishevelment, and his expensive Italian suit seemed to hang differently on his frame, as if the weight of the morning's testimony had physically diminished him. Webb had spent the 90-minute break in frantic consultation with his team of associates, their emergency strategy session resembling a war council, planning a last-ditch offensive. The conference room adjacent to the courthouse had been littered with discarded legal briefs, empty coffee cups, and the desperate scribblings of lawyers trying to salvage the unsalvageable. His junior associate, Jennifer Walsh, had pulled up 17 different precedents challenging animal testimony, but even she had admitted that none directly addressed what they had witnessed that morning. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Webb began, his voice carrying forced authority as he approached the witness stand where 7-year-old Lily Matthews sat with Hero lying calmly beside her. What we've seen here today is nothing more than an elaborate performance, a series of trained behaviors that have no more legal validity than a circus act. His words rang hollow in the hushed courtroom, and several jurors visibly recoiled at his characterization of the traumatized child's testimony. Dr. Rebecca Torres, seated in the front row with her detailed training logs and video documentation, felt her stomach clench as she watched Webb prepare to attack the communication system she had spent months perfecting with Lily. Every gesture, every response had been painstakingly developed not as tricks, but as a legitimate language that gave voice to a child who had been robbed of her words by trauma. Webb's strategy was as calculated as it was cruel. He would attempt to demonstrate that Hero was simply a well-trained performer responding to commands rather than a genuine interpreter of Lily's memories. "Miss Matthews," he said, his tone deceptively gentle, while his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Can you make your dog fetch something for you?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but Prosecutor Amanda Foster immediately recognized the trap. If Lily could make Hero perform random tasks unrelated to her testimony, Webb would argue that the previous demonstrations were merely trained tricks rather than authentic communication of witness trauma. Lily looked up at Webb with the wide-eyed confusion of a child who couldn't understand why this man was being mean to her after she had done something so difficult and brave. Her small hand moved instinctively to Hero's head, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of his golden fur. The courtroom held its breath as everyone waited to see how she would respond to this crucial challenge. What happened next stunned even Foster, who thought she had prepared for every possible scenario. Instead of refusing or appearing confused, Lily straightened in her chair with a dignity that seemed far beyond her 7 years. She looked directly at Webb, then made a series of deliberate gestures that were completely different from anything she had done during her direct testimony. Hero immediately responded by walking to the court reporter's station, gently picking up a pencil that had fallen to the floor and bringing it back to Lily. Then, without any additional signals from the child, he walked to the water pitcher on the prosecution table, somehow managed to pour water into a cup using his mouth to tilt the pitcher, and brought the cup to the bailiff, who was standing near the jury box. The courtroom erupted in amazed murmurs as spectators realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Lily had not only demonstrated that she could direct Hero to perform completely unrelated tasks, but Hero had also performed complex actions that clearly required intelligence and understanding rather than simple rote training. Webb's face flushed crimson as he realized his strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting the communication system, Lily had proven its sophistication and her complete control over it. That's very impressive," he stammered, his composure cracking visibly. "But it still doesn't prove that your earlier demonstrations were accurate representations of what you claim to have witnessed." Margaret Chun, juror number 7, leaned forward with intense interest. The retired accountant's analytical mind was working overtime, processing what she had just observed. The child's ability to direct the dog through multiple complex tasks actually strengthened the credibility of her earlier testimony rather than undermining it. But Webb wasn't finished. With the desperation of a drowning man grasping for any available lifeline, he pressed forward with increasingly aggressive questioning. "Isn't it true that you've been coached by Dr. Torres to make these gestures? Isn't it true that you're just following a script that adults have taught you?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Lily's composure began to crack. Her lower lip trembled as she stared at the intimidating man towering over her, his voice growing louder and more insistent with each question. Tears began to form in her dark eyes, and her small body seemed to shrink further into the witness chair. Dr. Torres gripped her notebook so tightly, her knuckles had turned white, watching helplessly as Webb's aggressive tactics threatened to re-traumatize the child. She had worked so hard to help. In the gallery, Lily's grandmother, Margaret, half rose from her seat, her maternal instincts screaming at her to protect her granddaughter from this legal predator. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point as Webb continued his assault on the 7-year-old witness. "You don't really remember what happened that night, do you? You're just doing what the adults told you to do, aren't you?" And then, in a moment that would be remembered long after the trial ended, Lily Matthews found her voice. Standing up in the witness chair, with Hero immediately rising to stand protectively beside her, Lily looked directly at Marcus Webb and spoke her first words in 6 months. "Stop being mean to Dr. Torres. She helped me tell the truth about the bad man who hurt Sarah." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. 200 people collectively holding their breath as they processed what they had just heard. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. In deference to this miraculous moment when a traumatized child reclaimed her voice in defense of the people who had given her the tools to seek justice. The jury deliberation room on the third floor of Jefferson County Courthouse had never witnessed such an emotionally charged discussion in its 70-year history. 12 ordinary citizens sat around the scarred wooden table, each still processing the extraordinary testimony they had witnessed over the past 3 days. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across legal pads filled with notes that seemed inadequate to capture the profound experience they had shared. Margaret Chun, the retired accountant who had been selected for her logical approach, found herself wiping away tears as she reviewed her meticulously detailed notes. In 30 years of analyzing data and evidence, she told her fellow jurors, her voice thick with emotion, I have never seen anything more authentic or compelling than what that little girl showed us. The specificity of her communications, the way the dog responded to signals so subtle, most of us couldn't even see them. This wasn't performance art. This was truth in its purest form. Juror number 4, Michael Rodriguez, nodded emphatically. The construction foreman with 2 young daughters of his own had been visibly shaken by Lily's testimony. When she demonstrated what happened to Sarah through that dog, I saw my own kids' faces. No child could fake that level of detail, that emotional truth. And when she finally spoke up to defend Dr. Torres, he shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. The deliberation had begun with the standard reading of jury instructions, but it quickly became clear that this case transcended normal legal proceedings. Juror number 9, elderly Mrs. Patterson, spoke for many when she said, I've been called for jury duty 4 times in my life, and I thought I understood what evidence looked like. But what we witnessed in that courtroom was something entirely different. It was like watching justice itself find a voice. Outside the deliberation room, the courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity. News crews from 3 states had set permanent camps in the parking lot, their reporters providing hourly updates to a nation captivated by the story of a traumatized child who had revolutionized the legal system. Social media exploded with hashtags, #JusticeForLily, and #HeroTheWitness, as people around the world followed the case that was redefining how courts could accommodate vulnerable witnesses. In the victim services room, Sarah Mitchell's parents sat with prosecutor Amanda Foster, their faces etched with the exhaustion of 6 months spent fighting for justice for their murdered daughter. Linda Mitchell clutched the same framed photo of Sarah she had brought to every court hearing, her fingers tracing the glass over her daughter's smiling face. When Lily showed us what happened, she whispered to Foster, it was like Sarah was finally able to tell us goodbye. Thomas Kane paced his holding cell like a caged animal, his court-appointed psychiatrist having documented 3 separate panic attacks since Lily's testimony concluded. The man who had maintained his innocence for 6 months now muttered incoherently about the girl and her dog, his carefully constructed facade of normalcy completely shattered by the truth delivered through the most unlikely witnesses. Defense attorney Marcus Webb sat in his office, staring at the wall of legal achievements that had once represented the pinnacle of his career. His reputation as the lawyer who could get anyone acquitted lay in ruins, destroyed not by prosecutorial brilliance or forensic evidence, but by the honest testimony of a 7-year-old girl and her golden retriever. His phone hadn't stopped ringing with calls from reporters, but he had no words to explain how his aggressive cross-examination had backfired so spectacularly. Dr. Rebecca Torres waited in the courthouse cafeteria with Lily and her grandmother, Hero lying calmly at the child's feet as if sensing that his most important work was nearly complete. The 3 months of intensive training, the development of an entirely new communication system, the countless hours of building trust. It had all led to this moment of waiting for 12 strangers to validate what they knew to be true. "Dr. Torres," Lily said quietly, her voice still fragile from months of silence, but growing stronger with each word. "Will other kids like me be able to use Hero's way of talking in court?" The question carried the weight of future generations, of traumatized children who might find their voices through the precedent being set in this very courthouse. At 4:47 p.m., after exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The speed of their decision surprised legal experts who had predicted days of deliberation, given the unprecedented nature of the testimony. Court officers quickly assembled the key participants, and within 30 minutes, Courtroom 3A was packed once again with the same faces who had witnessed legal history being made. Judge Patricia Harrison called the court to order, her voice betraying none of the emotion she felt as she prepared to hear the verdict that would determine not just Thomas Kane's fate, but the future of how the justice system accommodated its most vulnerable witnesses. Has the jury reached a verdict? Margaret Chun stood as the jury foreman, her voice clear and strong, despite the tears streaming down her face. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Thomas Kane, guilty." The word guilty seemed to echo through the courtroom like a thunderclap, releasing 6 months of pent-up emotion in a single moment. Sarah Mitchell's parents collapsed into each other's arms, their grief finally joined by the relief of justice served. In the gallery, families of Kane's other suspected victims wept openly, knowing that their loved one's killer would never hurt anyone again. Kane himself seemed to collapse inward, his body folding as if the weight of the verdict had physically struck him. The man who had terrorized a community for years was finally being held accountable for his crimes, brought down by the courage of a child who refused to let evil triumph over truth. When Judge Harrison announced the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Lily looked up at Hero and whispered, "We did it, boy." We told Sarah's story. The golden retriever's tail wagged gently, as if he understood that justice had finally been served through their extraordinary partnership. In that moment, everyone in courtroom 3 understood they had witnessed something far greater than a criminal conviction. They had seen the birth of a new form of justice that gave voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. 18 months after Thomas Kane's conviction sent shockwaves through the legal world, 8-year-old Lily Matthews stood confidently at the podium in the Russell Senate Office Building, her voice clear and strong as she addressed a room full of the nation's most powerful lawmakers. Hero, now wearing a special ceremonial vest embroidered with the words "First Courthouse Facility Dog," sat beside her with the calm dignity of a creature who understood his place in history. "Senators and representatives," Lily began, her small hands gripping the edges of the podium with determination rather than fear. "Before Hero helped me find my voice, I thought the bad man would never be punished for what he did to Sarah. Thought nobody would ever hear my story, because I was too scared to tell it with words." Her testimony carried the weight of personal experience, transformed into universal hope, and several hardened politicians found themselves wiping away unexpected tears. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent chambers. Dr. Rebecca Torres sat in the front row, her notebook filled not with training observations, but with pride-filled notes about how far her young patient had traveled on the journey from traumatized silence to national advocacy. Beside her, Amanda Foster, now serving as a special advisor to the Department of Justice on Victim Services, beamed with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had helped change the world. A legislation they were there to support, officially titled the Vulnerable Witness Protection and Alternative Testimony Act, but universally known as Lily's Law, represented the culmination of nearly 2 years of legal revolution that had begun in a small courthouse in Jefferson County. The bill would require all federal courts and encourage state courts to accommodate alternative forms of testimony for trauma victims, particularly children who had been rendered unable to speak by their experiences. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward with genuine interest. "Lily, can you tell us how your experience has helped other children?" The question opened the floodgates for a story that had captured the nation's imagination and transformed the lives of hundreds of vulnerable witnesses across the country. "Hero and I have traveled to 23 states." Lily replied with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who had grown comfortable with her role as an advocate. "We've helped 47 kids learn to tell their stories through their therapy. Dogs. Some of them couldn't talk because of what happened to them, like me. Others could talk, but were too scared to say the words in front of the people who hurt them." The success stories were indeed remarkable. In Ohio, 9-year-old Marcus Thompson had used the communication system to testify against his abusive stepfather, leading to a conviction that also solved 3 other child abuse cases. In California, twin sisters who had witnessed their mother's murder found their voices through a specially trained German shepherd named Justice. In Texas, a teenage victim of human trafficking had used a border collie named Hope to provide testimony that dismantled an international smuggling ring. Dr. Torres had documented each case meticulously, building an irrefutable body of evidence that the communication system worked not just as an innovative legal tool, but as a profound healing mechanism for traumatized children. The remarkable thing, she had testified earlier in the hearing, is that nearly 70% of the children who use this system eventually regain their verbal communication abilities. The dogs don't just help them testify, they help them heal. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual cases. Law schools had added courses on alternative testimony methods to their curricula. The FBI had established a specialized unit for training courthouse facility dogs. Therapy dog organizations across the country reported unprecedented demand for their services, with waiting lists stretching months into the future. Perhaps most significantly, the stigma surrounding trauma-induced mutism had begun to dissolve. Children who had previously been dismissed as unreliable witnesses were now seen as capable of providing some of the most compelling testimony courts had ever heard. The phrase "silent witness" had taken on an entirely new meaning in legal circles. "The most important thing," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence, "is that kids like me know that being scared doesn't mean we can't tell the truth. It just means we might need a different way to tell it." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but had chosen to use that experience to help others. In the gallery, Thomas Kane's other victims' families watched with amazement as the little girl who had helped convict their loved ones' killer continued to fight for justice on a national scale. Linda Mitchell, Sarah's mother, had become a close friend and supporter of Lily's advocacy work, often traveling with her to speak at conferences and training sessions. The success of Kane's prosecution had indeed led to the resolution of multiple cold cases. DNA evidence that had been sitting in storage for years was re-examined with fresh eyes, and Kane was ultimately linked to 6 additional murders across 3 states. His conviction had given closure to families who had waited years for answers, proving that Lily's courage had saved countless future victims while bringing justice for past ones. As the hearing concluded with unanimous committee approval of Lily's law, Senator Williams made a point of personally thanking both Lily and Hero. "Young lady," she said, kneeling down to Lily's eye level, "you have shown us that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places. You and Hero have not just changed the law, you've changed how we think about courage, justice, and the incredible bond between humans and animals." Hero's tail wagged gently as Lily scratched behind his ears, The golden retriever, seeming to understand that their work together had created something far greater than either could have achieved alone. The traumatized little girl, who had once been unable to speak, had become the voice for thousands of others who needed someone to believe in their truth. As they left the Capitol building that day, Lily looked up at Hero and smiled. "Ready to go help more kids, boy?" Hero's enthusiastic bark echoed off the marble columns, a sound of pure joy that represented hope, healing, and the unbreakable power of the bond between a child and her faithful companion who had helped her change the world.